Most of us know that human trafficking is a moral violation, but we don't really know about human trafficking. We're so far removed from crimes like this that we don't even know what they look like. I'm a college student that, like many of you, have probably made untrue assumptions about the concept of consent. The reason why I'm arguing about human trafficking is because even though we know it's wrong, some of us aren't entirely sure why. Our concepts of consent, work, and violence don't always line up with the horrific reality, and they fail us when they shouldn't. The social contracts that we found our respective societies on have, over time, changed and degraded. The victim blaming and sour ideas of consent and manipulation can be extremely painful to not only victims of trafficking, but victims of other kinds of physical and mental violence. The point is that human trafficking is inherently wrong, but are we sure we know why? My goal with this speech is to have you analyze your sentiments around violence, consent, and labor, and to have you understand exactly why trafficking is wrong. Before I go further, I would like to define consent. Consent is permission for something to happen or an agreement to do something. It is a social contract founded on trust. Consent can not only be given to whoever one pleases, but it can also be revoked at any time. Furthermore, the parameters of consent can be changed to fit the situation to make both parties more comfortable. Another necessary concept to understand is manipulation. Manipulation is defined as a behavior designed to exploit, control, or otherwise influence others to one's advantage, and is culturally regarded as a dishonest method of communication that comes at the expense of others. Finally, I'd like to explore violence. The World Health Organization defines violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Violence manifests itself more than just physically, but it also manifests itself in communities and societal structures. Societies are made up of people, and when people are hurt, so do the rest of us. Trafficking is the interaction of the exploiter and the exploited. Consent is violated when an agreement can no longer be modified or disengaged from. It is a continuous use of violence, physical and mental, to render consent obsolete for profit. Commercial sex is one of the most common forms of human trafficking. Also called compulsory prostitution, young women and men will be forced to participate in acts they don't want to be, usually under false pretenses. The methods of manipulation can vary from case to case, usually including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and intimidation. Sometimes the manipulation isn't just limited to the victim of the violence, but it can also extend to threats on people that the victim cares about. Sometimes, however, victims are initially compliant and willing to participate in commercial sex. Then they will revoke their consent. After consent has been revoked, the law regards the situation as trafficking. Prostitution on its own is illegal, so consent or the lack thereof is a defining factor in sentencing. The law is fully aware that even if the victim says that they consent, this might not always be the case, which is why it's so thoroughly examined. Gaslighting is a powerful tool. Prostitution itself is the oldest profession. It's not uncommon for prostitutes, in their desire to make more money, to desire a pimp. Pimps are people who handle the prostitute's clientele in exchange for a cut of the earnings. That's only in theory. More common than not, pimps use, once again, violence to take away the prostitute's consent in order to profit from her. They use a form of financial manipulation to keep a tight leash on her and threaten retaliation if she doesn't uphold her end of the bargain. For freelance women, this is terrifying. This is textbook exploitation. This kind of violence affects all of us, and because victims of this kind of trafficking use drugs to escape the pain or were even trapped by drugs, you can see many statistics already beginning to form in impoverished communities. Organ trade is yet another exploitative scheme. We can see cases of people voluntarily selling their organs. The process is illegal because it is inherently exploitative. For example, if you're from an impoverished area and you severely need funds, you'll consider selling your organs, and you might even go through with it. You might get paid a bit of change and go on your way, but the amount you get paid in is less than 5% of the amount the organ trafficker themselves made. Despite victim compliance, this is not permitted by law. Even more, organ trafficking as a viable option, especially under a system like ours, provides an easy fill for a demand that is still struggling to be met in impoverished and underprivileged communities. Yet again, we see the financial exploitation of poor people, which is already common enough on its own. Another kind of organ trade is related to human smuggling. You'll be blackbirded and kidnapped and shipped to the location of the illegal activity and wake up in a bathtub short of a kidney. You can imagine how victims of heart harvesting end up. I'd like to add that human smuggling is different from human trafficking, although human smuggling usually leads to human trafficking. Forced labor is another kind of human trafficking. This includes labor camps such as that under the Nazi regime, but also schemes common to illegal immigrant labor. An excerpt from Human Rights First describes the kind of trafficking that takes place. A family in New Jersey recruited more than 20 girls and young women between the ages of 10 and 17 from Togo and Ghana to braid hair for up to 14 hours a day for no pay at salons in Newark and East Orange. The exploiters found their victims by identifying families seeking to send their daughters to the United States for school or jobs. The victims' passports were taken, and they were beaten and threatened if they did not return home immediately after work. This obviously violates the consent of multiple parties, not only the girls themselves, but that of the families that sent them there. Like all kinds of violence, this affects the rest of us. For example, smuggling people across borders to work for little or nothing screws with the pay of regular citizens, most of whom are already struggling. This also feeds into the hate and smear campaigns against immigrants who came unrelated to crime, which affects politics, which affects all of us, so on and so forth. For some, forced labor also encompasses penal labor. While I could argue that this also violates the consent of the prisoners, that gets into another discussion of punishment and rehabilitation that is for the most part off topic. I'll use this opportunity to address the exploiters rather than the exploited. The people who traffic work on multiple levels. Pimps usually work on an individual scale, while some who traffic can even be on a governmental scale. Think of the Nazi Party, who trafficked millions of Jews for labor. There's also organizational scale, like the cartel, who infiltrated the government and uses it as leverage to commit unspeakable acts, including trafficking not only of drugs, but of people. Consent is being broken on societal levels when things like this happens. As aforementioned, trafficking is wrong, and we know it's wrong. It's wrong because it violates the consent of those being victimized, violates the consent of their families, violates of, in some cases, the society around the victims. The manipulation and exploitation tactics traffickers use affect all of us at the end of the day. And knowing why we believe the things we believe in is imperative to forming thoughts around new concepts and problems.